Montana Territory, 1872. The sky stretched endless above the valley, painted in shades of orange and gold as the sun dipped behind the jagged mountain peaks. Dust swirled around Nathan McAllister as he rode toward the small settlement of Pine Creek, a place where the wilderness still ruled and civilization clung to the edges like a timid child. At 25, Nathan had already seen enough of the West to know one truth above all others: a man survived alone or he did not survive at all. Attachments were dangerous. They made you weak, vulnerable. They gave the unforgiving land one more way to break you. The young cowboy adjusted his hat, shielding eyes that had grown too hard for his years. The war had taken his father and brother. The frontier had claimed his mother to fever. What remained was a lean figure of sinew and determination atop a chestnut mare, with nothing to his name but the skills that kept him breathing from one sunrise to the next. Nathan had signed on with the Rocking M Ranch 3 days prior, another in a long line of outfits that had temporarily employed him. He never stayed longer than a season. Staying meant connections. Connections meant pain when they were inevitably severed. "Town's just ahead, boy," he murmured to his horse as they crested a small rise. Pine Creek wasn't much: a general store, a saloon that doubled as a hotel, a small church, and a scattering of homes and businesses that served the surrounding ranches. It was enough to resupply and perhaps enjoy a hot meal before heading back to the ranch. The main street was quiet as Nathan dismounted and hitched his horse outside the general store. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows between the buildings, and the air carried the familiar scents of dust, horses, and wood smoke. He checked his pocket watch, a gift from his father and one of the few possessions he truly valued, and noted he had an hour before he needed to start back. Inside the store, the floorboards creaked beneath his boots. A bell jangled above the door, announcing his presence to the proprietor, a round man with spectacles who nodded in greeting. Nathan tipped his hat and moved toward the counter with his list of supplies for the ranch. "Good afternoon," a soft voice came from his right. Nathan turned, and for a moment the world seemed to still. A young woman stood by a display of fabric, her slender fingers tracing patterns across a bolt of blue cotton. Her honey-blonde hair was gathered in a simple knot at the nape of her neck, with wayward strands framing a face that struck Nathan as both beautiful and haunted. She wore a modest dove-gray dress that couldn't disguise her graceful figure, and her eyes, clear blue like a mountain lake, met his with unexpected directness. "Afternoon, miss," Nathan replied, touching the brim of his hat. He meant to turn away immediately to attend to his business and leave, but something in her expression held him. "You must be new to these parts," she said, her voice carrying a hint of Eastern refinement. "I am Delilah Porter. My father owns the sawmill just north of town." Nathan McAllister, just hired on at the Rocking M. A shadow passed across her features at the mention of the ranch, Mr. Morrison's place. "I see." Before Nathan could inquire about her reaction, the storekeeper called out, "Miss Porter, your order's ready." Delilah nodded politely to Nathan. "Welcome to Pine Creek, Mr. McAllister. I hope you find what you're looking for here." As she moved to the counter, Nathan couldn't help but notice the careful way she carried herself, as if bearing an invisible weight. At perhaps 20 years old, she seemed too young for such burden. He turned his attention back to his list, chiding himself for his curiosity. Whatever troubles shadowed Delilah Porter's eyes were none of his concern. The West had taught him that minding his own business kept a man alive. Yet as he collected supplies and paid his bill, Nathan found his gaze drawn to her more than once. When their eyes met briefly across the store, she looked into the cowboy's eyes and he saw a fear he wanted to protect her from, though he couldn't name its source. The realization unsettled him. Protection meant involvement, and involvement was precisely what Nathan McAllister had spent years avoiding. Outside, as Nathan secured his packages to his saddle, a commotion erupted from the saloon across the street. A man stumbled through the batwing doors, clearly intoxicated and shouting obscenities. Nathan recognized the voice of his new employer, Curtis Morrison, a man already known for his volatile temper. "Porter," Morrison bellowed, steadying himself against a hitching post. "Where's that daughter of yours? Time she learned who runs this valley." Nathan's hand instinctively moved to his holster as he saw Delilah emerge from the store, her face pale but composed. She stepped forward, placing herself between Morrison and the store entrance. "Mr. Morrison, please, you're making a scene," she said, her voice steady despite the fear Nathan could now see plainly in her eyes. "Scene." I'll show you a scene when I take that mill from your father. Morrison lurched forward, and without thinking, Nathan moved. In 3 strides, he placed himself between Delilah and the drunk rancher. That's enough, Morrison, he said quietly, his voice carrying the edge of steel that had kept him alive through countless frontier conflicts. Morrison squinted, recognition slowly dawning. McAllister. What the hell are you doing? Suggesting you head back to the ranch, sir. Nathan kept his stance relaxed but ready, his eyes never leaving Morrison's face. For a tense moment, it seemed Morrison might escalate the confrontation, but the rancher finally spat in the dirt and muttered, "This ain't over. Tell your father that, girl." As Morrison staggered toward his horse, Nathan became acutely aware of Delilah standing close behind him, the faint scent of lavender water reaching him on the breeze. "Thank you," she said softly, "though I fear you may have just cost yourself a job." Nathan turned to face her. Wouldn't be the first time, won't be the last. He studied her face, noting the tension that hadn't left her eyes. "What's his quarrel with your family?" Delilah glanced down the street where Morrison was attempting to mount his horse. "It's complicated. Water rights primarily. Our mill sits on Pine Creek upstream from his ranch. He believes we're taking more than our share." "Are you?" Her eyes flashed. "Of course not. My father is a fair man, but Morrison doesn't see reason when it comes to water in this valley." She hesitated, then added, "You should know Mr. McAllister that working for the Rocking M means standing with Morrison in this dispute. Most of his hands have taken to harassing our workers, threatening our lumber shipments." Nathan considered this. He'd seen such disputes before, they rarely ended peacefully. "I hired on to wrangle cattle, not to frighten honest folk." Something in Delilah's expression softened. "Then you may be the first Rocking M hand with such principles in quite some time." The sun was sinking lower, warning Nathan that he should start back. "I should go," he said, though he found himself strangely reluctant. "Yes, you should." Delilah nodded toward where Morrison had finally managed to mount his horse. "He'll be in a fouler mood when he sobers up. Be careful, Mr. McAllister." As Nathan swung into his saddle, he tipped his hat to her. "Nathan," he corrected. "Mr. McAllister was my father." The hint of a smile touched her lips. "Be careful, Nathan." Riding back to the Rocking M, Nathan felt a strange disquiet settle over him. He'd stepped into something complicated, something that threatened the detachment he'd cultivated for years. Delilah Porter's eyes haunted him, not just their beauty, but the fear and resolve they contained. It was a dangerous combination for a man who'd sworn never to let anyone's troubles become his own. Yet as the ranch came into view, Nathan knew he'd made his choice the moment he stepped between Delilah and Morrison. Whatever came next, he couldn't walk away. Not yet. The next morning found Nathan in the stable, saddling his horse before dawn. He'd spent a restless night pondering his situation, finally deciding to ride into town early to speak with Samuel Porter before reporting for work. He needed to understand what he'd stepped into. "Heading out already, McAllister." The voice came from Hank Weston, Morrison's foreman and a man with cold eyes that missed nothing. "Thought I'd scout the north pasture before the day's work," Nathan replied evenly, checking his cinch. Weston leaned against the stable door. "Funny, that's not where your tracks led yesterday. Seemed more like you were headed to town." His hand rested casually on his holster. "Boss wasn't pleased about your interference." "I don't take to men threatening women, drunk or sober," Nathan said, meeting Weston's gaze directly. "If that's part of working for the Rocking M, I'll collect my pay and move on." Weston's mouth twisted into an unpleasant smile. "No need for that. Morrison appreciates a man with spine, even if it's misplaced. Just remember where your loyalties lie while you wear that brand." He nodded toward the Rocking M symbol on Nathan's saddlebag. Nathan mounted up, looking down at the foreman. "I'm loyal to whoever pays me honest wages for honest work, nothing more." As he rode out, Nathan felt Weston's eyes on his back like the barrel of a gun. The encounter confirmed his suspicions. Morrison's dispute with the Porters ran deeper than water rights, and the ranch hands were expected to take sides. It was precisely the entanglement Nathan had always avoided. The sawmill sat beside Pine Creek, where the water ran swift enough to power the great wheel that drove the saws. Morning mist still clung to the valley as Nathan approached, the rhythmic sound of water and machinery growing louder. Several men were already at work, moving lumber and preparing for the day's cutting. A tall man with graying blonde hair looked up from inspecting a log, his weathered face questioning as Nathan dismounted. "Can I help you, mister?" "Looking for Samuel Porter," Nathan replied. "You found him." The man wiped his hands on a handkerchief, assessing Nathan with intelligent blue eyes, the same shade as his daughter's. "You're Morrison's new hand." "Saw you in town yesterday." Nathan nodded. "Nathan McAllister. I wanted to speak with you about what happened." Porter gestured toward a small office at the edge of the mill yard. "Let's talk away from the noise." Inside the simple cabin that served as an office, Porter offered Nathan coffee from a pot heating on a small stove. "My daughter mentioned your intervention." "That was decent of you, especially considering who signs your pay vouchers." "That's partly why I'm here," Nathan said, accepting the steaming cup. "I don't aim to get caught in the middle of a range war." "What's really happening between you and Morrison?" Porter settled behind his desk with a sigh. "It started as a simple water dispute 2 years ago. The creek runs low in late summer, and Morrison claimed we were taking too much for the mill. But there's more to it." He paused, studying Nathan's face. "My late wife was Morrison's sister. Delilah is his niece." Nathan's surprise must have shown, for Porter nodded grimly. "Yes, family complications make for the worst feuds. When my wife died of fever 5 years ago, Morrison blamed me for not getting her to a doctor in time. The truth is, no doctor could have saved her, but grief makes men unreasonable. And now he wants the mill. He wants the water rights, certainly. But I think what he really wants is to drive us out, to punish me by taking everything I've built." Porter's weathered hands curled around his coffee cup. Lately, his methods have become more aggressive. Missing shipments, threatened workers, damaged equipment. "And Delilah?" Nathan asked, remembering the fear in her eyes. Porter's face darkened. "Morrison has taken to suggesting that since I took his sister, he has some claim to my daughter. Talks about how she should be living at the Rocking M, learning her proper place in the valley's hierarchy." He met Nathan's gaze directly. "I'll die before I let that happen." The protective instinct that had surfaced in Nathan the previous day flared again, stronger. "Has he tried to force the issue?" "Not physically, not yet, but his threats grow bolder." Porter leaned forward. "Why are you here, McAllister? What stake do you have in this?" Nathan considered the question. By all logic, he should ride back to the ranch, collect his wages, and move on to the next job. Yet something held him here, something more than the memory of fear in blue eyes. "I've spent years drifting," he finally said. "Taking jobs, moving on when things got complicated. It's a lonely way to live, but it's kept me alive." He set down his coffee cup. "Yesterday was the first time in a long while I felt I was standing on the right side of something." Porter studied him for a long moment. "That's an honest answer, at least, but it puts you in a difficult position." "I'm aware," Nathan stood, settling his hat back on his head. "I should get back before my absence is noted. I just wanted to understand what I was facing." As Nathan reached the door, Porter called after him. "McAllister, Delilah rides into town most mornings to deliver mail for the mill. Morrison's men have taken to following her. If you're truly on the right side of this, keep an eye out for her." Nathan nodded once and stepped outside, his mind heavy with new complications. As he mounted his horse, movement near the house adjacent to the mill caught his attention. Delilah stood on the porch, watching him. Their eyes met briefly across the yard before she turned and went inside, leaving Nathan with the unsettling feeling that he'd just crossed a line he couldn't step back from. The next few days passed in a strange tension. Nathan performed his duties at the Rocking M diligently, breaking horses and moving cattle with the skill that had earned him a reputation as a top hand. Morrison, either not remembering or choosing to ignore the confrontation in town, treated him with the same gruff respect he showed his better workers. But Nathan felt Weston's suspicious gaze following him, noting when he rode out alone, tracking his movements. On the fourth morning, Nathan was repairing fence in the north pasture when he spotted a familiar figure on the road that connected the mill to Pine Creek. Delilah rode side saddle on a dappled gray mare, a leather mailbag across her shoulder. She wore a simple riding dress of forest green, her honey blonde hair partially concealed by a modest hat. Nathan hesitated only briefly before mounting his horse and riding toward the road. He told himself it was only to fulfill his promise to Porter, nothing more. "Good morning," he called as he approached, keeping his voice casual in case any of Morrison's men were watching. Delilah reined in her mare, surprise evident in her expression. "Mr. McAllister, I didn't expect to see you." "Nathan," he reminded her, drawing alongside, "I'm mending fence in this section. Thought I might ride alongside you to town, if you don't mind the company." Something in her expression softened. "I would welcome it, actually. The road can be lonely." They rode in companionable silence for a time, the morning sun warming the valley around them. Nathan found himself stealing glances at her profile, noting the determined set of her jaw that belied her gentle appearance. "Your father told me about Morrison," Nathan finally said, "about your mother being his sister." Delilah's hands tightened on her reins. "Did he tell you that my uncle believes he has some claim on me because of it?" "He mentioned it." She turned to face him fully, her blue eyes intense. "What he likely didn't tell you is that Morrison has begun suggesting to everyone in the valley that he intends to bring me home to the Rocking M, that I belong under his guardianship, not my father's." Her voice was steady, but Nathan could hear the underlying fear. "He's even hinted that he has a suitable husband in mind for me." Weston, Nathan guessed, remembering the cold-eyed foreman's particular interest in his movements. Delilah nodded, looking away. "My uncle believes that marriage would solve everything. The water rights would become Morrison property through the union, and my father would be effectively pushed out of the valley." "And what do you want?" Nathan asked quietly. The question seemed to surprise her. "What I want," she gave a small, bitter laugh. "Women in this territory aren't often asked that question, are they? I want to help my father run the mill. I want to be left in peace to make my own choices. I want," she broke off, shaking her head. "It doesn't matter what I want. Morrison has power in this valley, money, men who do his bidding." "It matters," Nathan said firmly. "What you want matters." Delilah studied him with a curious expression. "You're not what I expected from a Rocking M hand. I told you I hired on to wrangle cattle, not to frighten honest folk." Nathan adjusted his hat, scanning the surrounding landscape out of habit. "Besides, I don't plan to stay long." No, there was something like disappointment in her voice. "I never do," he replied, more curtly than he intended. "Staying gets complicated." They had reached the outskirts of Pine Creek, and Delilah slowed her horse. "Well, complicated or not, I appreciate the escort." She hesitated, then added, "Father is hosting a small gathering at our home tomorrow evening. Some of the local families who support our side of the water dispute. Would you consider attending as our guest?" The invitation surprised Nathan. It was precisely the kind of entanglement he'd avoided for years, a social obligation, a declared alliance. Yet he found himself nodding before he could formulate a logical refusal. "I'll try to come," he said, knowing it was a commitment he shouldn't make. The smile that illuminated Delilah's face made something catch in Nathan's chest. "Until tomorrow evening then," she said, and turned her mare toward the post office. Nathan watched her go, aware that he was crossing boundaries he'd set for himself long ago. Worse, he found he didn't care as much as he should. That evening, as Nathan finished his duties at the ranch, Weston approached him near the corral. "Boss wants to see you," the foreman said, his expression unreadable, "in the main house." Nathan nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. The summons wasn't unexpected. Morrison often called in new hands after their first week to assess their work. Still, after his conversation with Delilah, Nathan felt a heightened wariness as he crossed the yard to the imposing two-story house that dominated the ranch compound. A house servant directed Nathan to Morrison's study, a wood-paneled room that smelled of tobacco and whiskey. The rancher sat behind a massive desk, examining ledgers in the lamplight. "McAllister," Morrison acknowledged, gesturing to a chair without looking up. "Weston says you're working out well, good with the horses especially." "Thank you, sir," Nathan replied, remaining standing. Morrison finally raised his eyes, studying Nathan with a shrewdness that belied his reputation for brute force. "You've been riding the north pasture these past few days." "Near the Porter property." It wasn't a question, and Nathan didn't treat it as one. "The fence needed mending. I handled it." "Indeed," Morrison leaned back in his chair. "You know, I don't recall our conversation in town the other day. Whiskey sometimes gets the better of me." His eyes narrowed slightly. "But I'm told you intervened when I was speaking with my niece." I don't take to seeing women threatened, Nathan said evenly, drunk or sober. To his surprise, Morrison laughed, direct. I appreciate that in a man. He stood, moving to pour 2 glasses of whiskey from a crystal decanter. What do you know about the situation with Porter's Mill? Nathan accepted the offered glass but didn't drink. Only what I've heard. Water dispute, family complication with your late sister. Morrison's face darkened momentarily at the mention of his sister. Samuel Porter is not fit to run that mill, not fit to raise my sister's daughter. The man is stubborn, refuses to acknowledge the natural order of things in this valley. He took a long swallow of whiskey. Delilah belongs at the Rocking M with family, with prospects for a proper marriage. Seems to me she's grown enough to decide where she belongs, Nathan observed, setting his untouched whiskey on the desk. Morrison's eyes hardened. You misunderstand me, McAllister. I'm not seeking your opinion on family matters. I'm informing you of how things stand. Porter's resistance ends soon, one way or another. He moved closer, his bulk intimidating in the confined space. You're good with horses, I'd like you to stay on, but understand this, my men stand with me, all of my men. The threat was clear. Nathan met Morrison's gaze steadily. I stand with whoever's in the right, Mr. Morrison. Always have. For a tense moment, Nathan thought Morrison might explode in anger, but the rancher merely smiled thinly. We'll see where you stand when the time comes. That'll be all, McAllister. Outside, the night air felt cool against Nathan's face, a relief after the oppressive atmosphere of Morrison's study. He walked slowly back to the bunkhouse, weighing his options. Logic dictated that he collect his wages in the morning and ride out, continuing his pattern of avoiding entanglements that could turn deadly. Yet as he lay in his bunk that night, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling, Nathan knew he wouldn't leave. Not yet. Something had shifted in him when he looked into Delilah's eyes and saw that fear he wanted to protect her from. Something he couldn't simply ride away from this time. The following evening, Nathan approached the Porter home with uncharacteristic nervousness. He'd taken care with his appearance, wearing his best shirt and brushing his hat free of dust. The house was modest compared to Morrison's sprawling ranch house, but well-built and inviting, with lamps glowing in the windows against the gathering dusk. Delilah herself answered his knock, her face lighting with genuine pleasure at the sight of him. She wore a dress of deep blue that matched her eyes, her hair arranged in an elegant style that softened her features. You came, she said, as if she'd half expected him to change his mind. I said I would, Nathan replied simply, removing his hat as he stepped inside. The gathering was small, as promised, perhaps a dozen people from the surrounding valley, mostly small ranchers and businessmen from town. Samuel Porter greeted Nathan warmly, introducing him around without mentioning his employment at the Rocking M. Nathan was grateful for the discretion. As the evening progressed, Nathan observed the dynamics of the group. These were people who had taken sides against Morrison in the water dispute, but their conversation revealed a deeper concern, fear of the ranchers' growing control over the valley's commerce and politics. He's bought the mortgage on the general store now, a weathered rancher named Taylor was saying. Henderson had no choice but to sell. Soon Morrison will control what supplies come into the valley and at what price. And Judge Wilson seems increasingly reluctant to rule against him in any legal matter, added the town's young doctor. The last 3 disputes were decided in Morrison's favor, despite clear evidence to the contrary. Samuel Porter nodded gravely. Which is why tonight's meeting is more than social. We need to stand united before Morrison consolidates any more power. Nathan listened quietly, understanding now why his presence was significant. As a Rocking M hand, his attendants signaled a crack in Morrison's united front. Later, as the group broke into smaller conversations, Delilah approached Nathan where he stood by the window. What do you think? She asked, her voice low. I think Morrison is moving faster than anyone realizes, he replied honestly. This isn't just about water or family pride anymore. He wants to own the valley outright. Delilah nodded, her expression troubled. Father believes we can stop him through legal means, but I'm not so sure, not when Morrison seems willing to use any method necessary. Including you, Nathan said, watching her face carefully. He made it clear to me yesterday that he expects to bring you home to the Rocking M soon, mentioned a proper marriage. Fear flickered briefly in her eyes, but she masked it quickly. I will never consent to such an arrangement. Would your consent matter to him? The blunt question hung between them, and Delilah's silence was answer enough. They both knew that in this territory, a woman had few legal protections against the will of male relatives, especially ones with Morrison's influence. Before they could continue the conversation, there was a commotion at the front door. A young mill worker burst in, his face flushed with exertion. "Mr. Porter, fire at the mill." Morrison's men were seen riding away just before it started. The room erupted in motion. Samuel Porter grabbed his coat, shouting instructions as the guests hurried to offer assistance. Nathan caught Delilah's arm as she moved to follow her father. "Stay here," he urged. "If this is Morrison's doing, it could be a trap." Her blue eyes flashed with determination. "That mill is our livelihood. I won't hide while it burns." Before Nathan could argue further, she was gone, following her father into the night. With a muttered curse, Nathan grabbed his hat and hurried after them, a sense of foreboding growing with each step. The scene at the mill was chaos. Flames illuminated the night sky, consuming the main sawing floor while men formed a bucket brigade from the creek. The water wheel itself was untouched, but the machinery it powered was engulfed in fire. Samuel Porter took charge immediately, directing efforts to save what could be saved and prevent the fire from spreading to the lumber stacks. Nathan joined the line, passing buckets and helping to organize the frantic efforts. From the corner of his eye, he saw Delilah working alongside the men, her fine dress now soaked and smudged with soot as she helped coordinate the firefighting efforts. Her face was set with determination, her fear channeled into purposeful action. Despite the gravity of the situation, Nathan felt a surge of admiration for her courage. Hours later, as dawn broke over the valley, the fire was finally contained. The mill building was heavily damaged, but the water wheel and some of the machinery might be salvageable. The lumber stacks had been spared, representing at least some of the Porter's assets. Exhausted, soot-covered workers gathered in small groups, assessing the damage. Nathan found Delilah sitting alone on a stack of lumber, staring at the smoldering remains of the mill. Her face was streaked with ash, her hair falling in disarray around her shoulders. She looked up as he approached, and the desolation in her eyes struck him like a physical blow. "This is only the beginning," she said quietly. "He won't stop until he has everything." Nathan sat beside her, offering his canteen. "Your father seems to think it can be fought legally." Delilah took a small sip of water, her hands trembling slightly. "My father is an honorable man who believes in justice. But Morrison doesn't play by those rules." She looked directly at Nathan, her gaze intense. "You work for him, you must see what he's capable of." "I've seen enough," Nathan agreed, "but I don't work for him anymore." "Not after this." Surprise flickered across her face. "You're leaving." "The Rocking M's," Nathan clarified, "not the valley." He hesitated, then added, "Not you." The words hung between them, more revealing than he'd intended. Delilah's expression softened, and for a moment, something other than fear or determination showed in her eyes. Before she could respond, however, her father approached, his face grim. "Delilah, Nathan," Samuel nodded to them both. "We've found evidence this was no accident." Coal oil splashed on the walls, multiple points of origin. "Morrison," Delilah said, the name like a curse on her lips. "We can't prove it," her father replied wearily. "But yes, almost certainly." He looked at Nathan. "Your position at the Rocking M is likely compromised after tonight." "It was compromised the moment I stepped between your daughter and Morrison in town," Nathan replied. "I'll collect my gear and clear out today." Porter nodded thoughtfully. "We'll need help rebuilding. The work pays less than the Rocking M, but it's honest." The offer surprised Nathan. It meant staying, committing to a side in the brewing conflict. It meant abandoning the detachment that had defined his life for years. Yet as he glanced at Delilah, at the hope carefully hidden behind her exhaustion, he found his answer came easily. "I'll start tomorrow," he said simply. Later that day, Nathan rode into the Rocking M for the last time. He'd timed his arrival for the noon meal, when most hands would be at the cookhouse, hoping to collect his belongings and leave without confrontation. But as he approached the bunkhouse, Weston stepped from the shadows of the porch. "Figured you'd show up eventually," the foreman said, his hand resting casually near his holster. "Saw you fighting that fire alongside Porter's men." Nathan dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate. "Just lending a hand to folks in trouble." Trouble they brought on themselves by defying Mr. Morrison. Weston's cold eyes narrowed. You're either with us or against us in this valley, McAllister. Time to choose. I already have, Nathan replied evenly. I quit, just came for my gear and wages. Weston smiled unpleasantly. Morrison figured as much, said to tell you there's no pay for men who stand with his enemies. Nathan had expected as much, but the blatant injustice still rankled. My gear then, I'll be on my way. Your gear's been moved, new policy, anything left in the bunkhouse belongs to the ranch when a man quits without notice. Weston straightened, his hand now resting openly on his gun. Morrison says you ride out with what you brought in, nothing more. It was a deliberate humiliation, designed to provoke a reaction. Nathan felt anger rise within him but kept his expression neutral. Most of his possessions were already in his saddlebags. He'd learned long ago to travel light. The only item of value in his trunk was his father's old Bible, containing the few family documents and mementos he possessed. The Bible was my father's, Nathan said quietly, has no value to anyone else. Something like genuine regret flickered across Weston's face. Orders are orders, McAllister. You can take it up with Morrison if you want to push the matter. For a moment Nathan considered it, but confronting Morrison now, alone and outnumbered, would only end badly. The Bible wasn't worth dying over, no matter its sentimental value. He would find another way to retrieve it later. Tell Morrison I'll be seeing him, Nathan said, swinging back into his saddle. It wasn't a threat, merely a statement of fact in a valley too small for their paths not to cross again. Weston nodded once, acknowledging the unspoken challenge. I'll tell him. Now ride out before the boys get back from lunch. Some of them might not be as civil as me about your change in loyalties. As Nathan rode away from the rocking M, he felt a curious lightness despite the loss of his wages and possessions. For the first time in years, he'd chosen a side based on what was right rather than what was expedient. The realization both terrified and exhilarated him. His path forward was uncertain. Working for Porter would earn him enemies, possibly dangerous ones. Yet when he thought of Delilah's eyes, their fear, their courage, their unexpected warmth when she looked at him, Nathan knew he couldn't have chosen differently. The following weeks established a new rhythm to Nathan's life. He threw himself into the work of rebuilding the mill, his skills as a horseman less valuable here than his strong back and willingness to learn new trades. Samuel Porter proved to be a fair employer and a patient teacher, showing Nathan the mechanics of the sawmill operations and entrusting him with increasing responsibility as the rebuilding progressed. Delilah was a constant presence at the mill, managing accounts and correspondence while assisting with the reconstruction wherever needed. Nathan found himself looking forward to their interactions, from shared meals with the work crew to quiet conversations when the day's labor was done. One evening, as sunset painted the valley in gold, Nathan and Delilah sat on the newly rebuilt mill porch, watching as workers headed home for the day. We'll be operational within the week, Delilah observed, satisfaction evident in her voice. Father says it's the fastest rebuild he's ever seen. Your father's a good man to work for, Nathan replied. The crew respects him. Delilah studied him with curious eyes. And you? Do you regret your decision to stay? Nathan considered the question honestly. The past weeks had been hard work for modest pay. Morrison's influence had made supplies harder to obtain and credit more difficult to secure. Several workers had been harassed in town, and Nathan himself had been refused service at the saloon, now firmly under Morrison's control. Yet despite these hardships, Nathan had found something he'd long thought lost, a sense of purpose, of belonging to something worthwhile. And if he was honest with himself, much of that feeling centered on the woman beside him. No regrets, he finally said, though I do miss my father's Bible. It's the only thing from the rocking M I wish I could recover. Delilah's expression softened. I didn't know, was it very important to you? It contained the only images I have of my parents, a tintype of my mother and father on their wedding day, letters my brother sent during the war. Nathan shrugged, trying to dismiss the ache of loss. Just mementos, nothing of real value. Except to you, Delilah said gently, her hand brushing his on the porch railing. The touch was brief but sent warmth spreading through Nathan's chest. Before he could respond, hoofbeats approached from the direction of town. A rider appeared around the bend in the road, pushing his horse hard. Nathan recognized David Langley, the young doctor from Pine Creek who had attended the gathering at the Porter home. Delilah, is your father here? Langley called as he dismounted, his face grave. In his office, Delilah replied, rising quickly. What's happened? Morrison's made his move, Langley said, removing his hat. He's filed a legal claim stating the mill is operating illegally, without proper water rights. Judge Wilson has scheduled a hearing for next week. If the ruling goes against your father, Morrison could take possession of the mill and all its assets. Nathan felt Delilah stiffen beside him. On what grounds? She demanded. Morrison claims he holds the original territorial grant to Pine Creek's water rights through his purchase of the old Spanish land claim. Your father's subsequent permit would be invalid if Morrison's claim holds up. Langley shook his head grimly. Given Wilson's recent rulings, I'm not optimistic. As Delilah hurried to find her father, Nathan followed Langley toward the office. Is there any way to challenge the claim? He asked the doctor. Langley glanced at him appraisingly. Only if someone could produce evidence that Morrison's Spanish grant is fraudulent or that Porter's water claim predates it. He lowered his voice. There are rumors that Morrison paid a considerable sum to have certain land office records altered or destroyed. But proving that would be nearly impossible. Inside Porter's office, the atmosphere was tense as Langley repeated his information. Samuel Porter listened silently, his weathered face revealing little of his thoughts. So he's finally moved to legal means, Porter said when Langley finished. I've been expecting this, though I'd hoped the rebuilding would have convinced him of our determination to stay. Father, we can't let him take the mill, Delilah insisted, her eyes flashing with determination. Everything we've rebuilt, everything Mother helped establish. I have no intention of surrendering without a fight, Porter assured her, but we must be prepared for the possibility that the law may not be on our side, despite the justice of our cause. The conversation turned to legal strategies and potential witnesses who might support Porter's claim. Nathan listened carefully, noting the practical obstacles they faced. Morrison's influence extended to the territorial officials who would normally validate land claims. The local banker who had financed Porter's original mill construction had recently sold his interests to a consortium controlled by Morrison allies. Their legal position was precarious at best. As the meeting concluded, Nathan found himself walking with Delilah toward her home in the gathering darkness. She had been quiet since Langley's departure, her earlier optimism replaced by a tense determination. What are you thinking? Nathan asked gently. Delilah stopped, turning to face him in the twilight. I'm thinking that Morrison has planned this meticulously. The fire was meant to weaken us financially before this legal challenge. Her voice was steady, but Nathan could see the strain in her eyes. I'm thinking that my father believes too strongly in justice, in a place where power matters more than right. You don't believe you can win the hearing? No, she said simply. Not with Judge Wilson presiding in half the territory afraid to cross Morrison. She searched his face in the fading light. You've stayed neutral in this valley's disputes for years, riding from ranch to ranch. What would you do in our position? The question caught Nathan off guard. He'd spent so long avoiding entanglements that strategic thinking about land disputes felt foreign to him. Yet as he considered the Porter's situation, an idea began to form. Morrison wants the mill for the water rights, not the lumber business, he said slowly. What if you separated the two? Sell the mill equipment and lumber stocks, but retain ownership of the land and water access. Delilah frowned. That would mean abandoning the business my parents built. Temporarily, Nathan clarified. Morrison's claim is specifically against the mill's water usage. If there's no operational mill when the hearing occurs, his case loses urgency. Meanwhile, you could establish a new operation elsewhere, perhaps downriver, where his water rights claims wouldn't apply. As the implications of his suggestion unfolded, Delilah's expression shifted from skepticism to consideration. A strategic retreat rather than a pitched battle we're likely to lose. Nathan nodded. Sometimes in a fight, the best move isn't to stand your ground, but to change the nature of the confrontation entirely. Delilah studied him with new appreciation. You've thought about this more deeply than you let on. I've seen my share of land disputes, Nathan admitted. Few end well for the smaller operator who tries to fight directly against a powerful opponent. They resumed walking, discussing the practicalities of Nathan's suggestion. By the time they reached the Porter home, Delilah had developed several refinements to the plan, her quick mind identifying potential buyers for the equipment and alternative locations for a smaller initial operation. At the porch steps, she turned to him, her face serious in the lamplight from the windows. "Thank you, Nathan, not just for the strategy, but for staying. For caring about what happens to us." She hesitated, then added softly, "to me." Before Nathan could respond, she leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek, then quickly ascended the steps and disappeared inside, leaving him standing in the yard with his heart beating an unfamiliar rhythm. That night, as Nathan lay in the small cabin Porter had provided for him near the mill, he contemplated how thoroughly his life had changed in the weeks since he'd first ridden into Pine Creek. The solitary drifter who avoided attachments had become emotionally invested in the fate of the Porter mill, and more significantly, in Delilah herself. The realization should have triggered his instinct to move on, to protect himself from the inevitable pain that caring brought. Instead, Nathan found himself planning how best to help the Porters overcome Morrison's challenge, his mind working through alternatives and contingencies until sleep finally claimed him. The next morning brought Samuel Porter to Nathan's cabin before dawn, his expression grave. "Delilah told me your suggestion," he said without preamble. "I've been considering it all night." Nathan offered coffee, which Porter declined with a shake of his head. "I can see the strategic wisdom," the older man continued, pacing the small cabin. "But dismantling what Catherine and I built, what Delilah has worked so hard to preserve, feels like surrendering." "Not surrendering," Nathan countered. "Adapting, fighting on different ground where you have the advantage." Porter smiled sadly. "You sound like Catherine. She always told me I was too stubborn for my own good." He sighed heavily. "There's something else you should know. Morrison came to see me last night, after you and Delilah left." Nathan straightened, instantly alert. What did he want? "To offer terms," Porter's voice hardened. "He'll withdraw the legal challenge if Delilah agrees to marry Weston within the month. The mill would remain in family hands, technically, with Weston installed as manager and me relegated to a silent partner." The thought of Delilah forced into marriage with the cold-eyed foreman sent a surge of protective anger through Nathan. "I assume you refused." "Of course, but Morrison was confident I'd reconsider once I understood how thoroughly he's arranged for our defeat in court." Porter met Nathan's gaze directly. "He also mentioned you specifically, said you'd interfered in family business once too often, and that you'd regret choosing sides." The threat didn't surprise Nathan, but its inclusion in Morrison's negotiations indicated the rancher considered him a significant obstacle. It was both flattering and concerning. "Does Delilah know about this offer?" he asked. Porter shook his head. "I saw no reason to burden her with it. She would refuse immediately, and Morrison would only escalate his pressure." He rubbed his forehead wearily. "Your strategic withdrawal plan may be our best option. I'll speak with potential buyers for the equipment today." As Porter left, Nathan felt the weight of the situation settling more firmly on his shoulders. Morrison's willingness to threaten him directly suggested the conflict was entering a more dangerous phase. The rancher clearly viewed Delilah as a possession to be acquired, not a person with her own will. Such men were particularly dangerous when thwarted. Over the next few days, Porter's plan to liquidate the mill equipment progressed rapidly. Word spread through the valley that the Porter Lumber Company was selling assets, generating interest from operators in neighboring territories. Morrison made no move to interfere, perhaps believing the sales indicated surrender rather than strategic repositioning. Nathan found himself increasingly in Delilah's company as they coordinated the inventory and sales. Their conversations ranged beyond business matters to personal histories and future hopes. Nathan shared stories of his travels across the territories, while Delilah spoke of her Eastern education and her mother's influence on her unconventional ambitions. "She taught me that a woman's mind was as valuable as any man's," Delilah explained as they walked along Pine Creek one evening, taking a rare break from their work. "She kept the mill's books, managed correspondence with buyers, even negotiated timber contracts when father was ill one winter." "She sounds remarkable," Nathan observed, noting the pride in Delilah's voice when she spoke of her mother. "She was," Delilah smiled at the memory. "Uncle Curtis Morrison adored her when they were young. That's partly why her death affected him so deeply. He couldn't accept that no one was to blame." she sighed, skipping a stone across the creek's surface. I sometimes wonder if he sees her in me, and if that's why he's so determined to control my future. Nathan watched her profile in the fading light, struck by her capacity for empathy even toward someone who threatened her freedom. Understanding him doesn't excuse his actions, he said gently. No, she agreed, but it helps me remember he wasn't always the man he's become. She turned to face Nathan fully. What about you? What shaped the man who refuses to stay in one place for long? The direct question caught Nathan off guard. He'd shared facts about his travels, but little about his motivations or the losses that had set him on his solitary path. The war partly, he finally said, finding it strangely easy to open up to her. I was too young to fight, but old enough to understand what it cost my family. My father never came home. My brother returned so changed that he couldn't bear to stay. He rode west ahead of me, and I never found him. Nathan picked up a stone, turning it over in his hands. My mother held on until I was 17, then fever took her. I'm sorry, Delilah said softly, her hand touching his arm in gentle sympathy. After that, I learned that attachment only led to loss, Nathan continued. Easier to keep moving, to avoid putting down roots that could be torn up. He looked at her directly, until now. The admission hung between them, more revealing than any declaration. Delilah's eyes softened and she stepped closer, her hand still on his arm. And now, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before Nathan could answer, the sound of approaching horses interrupted the moment. They turned to see Samuel Porter riding toward them, accompanied by Dr. Langley. The expressions on both men's faces warned of trouble before they even spoke. Morrison's moved up the hearing, Porter announced without preamble. Judge Wilson has scheduled it for tomorrow morning instead of next week. That's not enough time, Delilah protested. We haven't completed the equipment sales and our documentation. Precisely why Morrison pushed for the change, Langley interrupted grimly. He's claiming the pending sales indicate you're attempting to strip assets before a legal judgment can be enforced. Nathan felt a cold certainty settle in his stomach. He knew about our strategy all along. Porter nodded wearily. It seems we have an informant among our workers or buyers. Morrison has outmaneuvered us. The gravity of their situation was clear. With the hearing moved up, their strategic retreat was incomplete, leaving them vulnerable to exactly the outcome they'd sought to avoid, a legal ruling that could transfer ownership of the mill property to Morrison before they could secure their position. What can we do? Delilah asked, her earlier warmth replaced by the determined focus Nathan had come to admire. Prepare as best we can for tomorrow, her father replied. Langley has agreed to represent us, since no lawyer in the territory will take our case. As they rode back to the mill to gather documentation and prepare their arguments, Nathan's mind raced through possibilities. Their legal position was weak, their strategy undermined. Yet surrender would mean not only the loss of the Porter's livelihood but Delilah's freedom as well, given Morrison's determination to see her married to Weston. Later that night, after hours of preparation, Nathan found himself alone with Delilah on the mill porch. Porter and Langley had retired to review territorial statutes, leaving them to organize the property deeds and water permit documentation. We'll lose tomorrow, Delilah said quietly, stating what they both knew but had avoided voicing. Even with our best arguments, Judge Wilson won't rule against Morrison. Nathan couldn't offer false hope. Probably not, he agreed, but the fight doesn't end with one ruling. Delilah's hands stilled on the papers she was sorting. What other options do we have? Once Morrison legally controls the property, he'll use that leverage against father, against me. The fear in her voice stirred Nathan's protective instincts, but also his strategic thinking. What if we created leverage of our own? What do you mean? Morrison wants the water rights and control over you, Nathan said slowly, an idea forming. But what if you were no longer available for his marriage plans? Delilah frowned. I don't understand. Nathan took a deep breath, surprised by his own boldness. Marry me, tonight before the hearing. As your husband, I would have legal standing to challenge Morrison's control over your future, regardless of the property ruling. The shock on Delilah's face made him immediately regret his impulsive suggestion. I'm sorry, he backtracked quickly. That was presumptuous. No, Delilah interrupted, her expression shifting from shock to thoughtful consideration. "It's actually quite practical. Morrison couldn't force me into marriage with Weston if I were already wed." She studied his face carefully. "But marriage is a significant commitment, Nathan, far more binding than staying to help rebuild a mill." The caution in her voice was warranted. Nathan had proposed the idea as strategy, but as he contemplated the reality of marriage to Delilah, he realized his motivations weren't purely practical. The woman before him had awakened feelings he'd long suppressed: admiration, protectiveness, and something deeper that he hesitated to name. "It would be a real marriage," he said quietly, "not just a legal maneuver, if you'd have me." Delilah's eyes widened at his words, searching his face for confirmation of their meaning. Whatever she saw there must have reassured her, for her expression softened into a smile that transformed her features. "I would have you, Nathan McAllister," she replied, her voice steady despite the flush rising to her cheeks. "For practical reasons and impractical ones as well." The simple acceptance sent a surge of emotion through Nathan: relief, joy, and a fierce determination to prove worthy of her trust. Before he could respond, however, the sound of a throat clearing interrupted them. Samuel Porter stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I couldn't help overhearing," he said, stepping onto the porch. "You're proposing to marry my daughter before tomorrow's hearing." Nathan straightened, meeting the older man's gaze directly. "Yes, sir, with your blessing if possible, without it if necessary." The boldness of his statement surprised even himself, but Nathan found he meant every word. The months of cautious detachment from life's connections had given way to a certainty that Delilah Porter was worth any risk, any commitment. Porter studied him for a long moment, then turned to his daughter. "And this is what you want, Delilah, not just as strategy against Morrison, but as your choice for a husband." Delilah moved to stand beside Nathan, her hand finding his with natural ease. "It is, father. I believe it has been since he first stepped between me and Uncle Curtis in town." A complex series of emotions crossed Porter's weathered face: concern, resignation, and finally a quiet acceptance. "Catherine always said you'd know your own mind when the time came," he said softly. "I suppose I shouldn't be surprised you've chosen a man as stubborn and principled as yourself." He extended his hand to Nathan, who clasped it firmly. "You have my blessing," Porter continued, "though I warn you that marriage to a Porter woman requires fortitude. They are not easily discouraged once they've set their course." "I'm counting on that, sir," Nathan replied, feeling Delilah's hand tighten in his. The next hours passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Langley was dispatched to wake the minister, a sympathetic man who had opposed Morrison's increasing control of the valley. Witnesses were gathered from among the most trusted mill workers. By midnight, in the small church illuminated by lamplight, Nathan found himself standing before the altar with Delilah at his side. She wore her mother's wedding dress, hastily altered, its simple elegance highlighting her natural beauty. Her honey-blonde hair was arranged in loose curls beneath a simple veil, and her blue eyes held a certainty that steadied Nathan's own nervousness. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. As Nathan spoke his vows, he realized he was committing not just to a strategic alliance, but to a life shared with a woman whose courage and determination had awakened his long-dormant heart. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was tender yet charged with promise. Dawn found the newly married couple riding toward town for the hearing, accompanied by Samuel Porter and Dr. Langley. Nathan felt a strange calm despite the legal battle ahead. Whatever Judge Wilson decided about the mill property, Morrison's plan to control Delilah through marriage had been thwarted. The courthouse was already crowded when they arrived, news of the hastened hearing having spread throughout the valley. Morrison sat at the plaintiff's table with his lawyer, a slick-looking man imported from the territorial capital. Weston occupied a seat directly behind them, his cold eyes narrowing when they fixed on Nathan and Delilah's clasped hands. Judge Wilson entered, a thin man with shrewd eyes that missed nothing as they swept over the assembled parties. "This court will hear arguments in the matter of Morrison versus Porter regarding water rights and property claims," he announced, settling behind his bench. Morrison's lawyer rose first, presenting their case with polished eloquence. He detailed the Spanish land grant that allegedly gave Morrison priority rights to Pine Creek's water, arguing that Porter's operation had always been technically illegal despite years of operation. When Langley rose for the defense, he focused on the practical reality of the mill's long-established presence and the community's reliance on its services. While legally sound, his arguments seemed to make little impression on Wilson, whose expression remained impassive throughout. As the arguments concluded, Wilson addressed the court. Before rendering judgment, are there any final matters either party wishes to bring before the court? Nathan felt Delilah squeeze his hand encouragingly. They had anticipated this moment. He stood, drawing surprised murmurs from the spectators. "Your Honor, I wish to inform the court of a matter directly relevant to these proceedings," Nathan announced clearly. "I am Nathan McAllister, as of last night lawfully wedded husband to Delilah Porter McAllister. As her husband, I assert spousal interest in any property rights affecting my wife and formally request to be added to these proceedings as an interested party." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Morrison's face darkened with fury as he turned to glare at Delilah, who met his gaze with composed defiance. Weston half rose from his seat before Morrison's lawyer restrained him with a warning gesture. Judge Wilson banged his gavel for order, his expression betraying genuine surprise. "This is most irregular, Mr. McAllister. Marriage during pending litigation could be construed as an attempt to complicate legally straightforward proceedings." "There is nothing legally straightforward about attempting to seize a family business through manipulated water rights claims, Your Honor," Nathan replied steadily. "Especially when such claims are motivated by personal vendettas rather than genuine legal grievances." Morrison surged to his feet. "This is outrageous. The girl was promised," he caught himself, but not before revealing more than he intended. "Promised, Mr. Morrison?" Wilson asked, his eyebrows raised. "I was unaware that Miss Porter, Mrs. McAllister now, was party to any formal betrothal." Morrison's lawyer intervened smoothly. "My client misspoke, Your Honor. The marriage, while surprising, does not materially affect the water rights issue before the court." "On the contrary," Langley countered, seizing the opportunity, "it establishes that Morrison's interest in these proceedings extends beyond mere water usage to personal matters involving the Porter family. We contend this constitutes improper motivation for the lawsuit and requests the court dismiss the case on these grounds." Judge Wilson studied the parties thoughtfully. Despite his known alignment with Morrison's interests, he was also a man concerned with judicial appearances. Morrison's outburst had created a complication that couldn't be easily dismissed without raising questions about the court's impartiality. "I will recess to consider these developments," Wilson finally announced. "Court will reconvene in 1 hour." As the judge departed, Morrison stormed across the courtroom, ignoring his lawyer's attempt to restrain him. He stopped directly before Nathan and Delilah, his face flushed with rage. "You think this changes anything?" he hissed, his voice low enough that only they could hear. "A hastily arranged marriage won't protect you or this property. I'll still take that mill, one way or another." Nathan stepped slightly forward, placing himself between Morrison and Delilah. "The mill is just lumber and machinery," he replied calmly. "What you really wanted was Delilah, and she's chosen differently. Accept it and end this vendetta, Morrison, for your sister's sake if nothing else." The mention of his sister caused Morrison to flinch, as if struck. For a brief moment, something like grief flickered across his features before hardening again into anger. "You know nothing about my sister or what she would have wanted," he growled. "This isn't over, McAllister, not by a long shot." As Morrison stalked away, Delilah slipped her hand into Nathan's. "That went as well as could be expected," she murmured. "He's not a man who accepts defeat gracefully," Nathan replied, watching Morrison confer intensely with Weston near the courthouse door. "Whatever Wilson decides, we should be prepared for Morrison to retaliate." Samuel Porter joined them, his expression troubled. "Wilson is in a difficult position. He's been Morrison's man for years, but your marriage has created legal complications he can't easily ignore without appearing corrupt." He sighed heavily. "Still, I wouldn't count on a favorable ruling." His prediction proved accurate. When court reconvened, Wilson delivered a carefully worded judgment that attempted to satisfy both parties while ultimately favoring Morrison's position. While the court recognizes the Porter Lumber Company's long-standing operation and community importance, Wilson intoned, the legal priority of water rights must be respected. Morrison's claim, based on the Spanish land grant, predates Porter's territorial permit and thus takes precedence. Delilah's hand tightened in Nathan's as the judge continued. However, the court acknowledges that immediate cessation of operations would cause undue hardship. Therefore, the Porter Lumber Company is granted 6 months to either relocate operations downstream where their water usage would not conflict with Morrison's rights, or to negotiate a formal water usage agreement with the plaintiff. The judgment was a partial victory at best. They had time, but the fundamental ruling favored Morrison, giving him significant leverage in any negotiations. Nathan felt Delilah's disappointment as keenly as his own, but her composure never wavered as they rose to leave the courtroom. Outside, Samuel Porter sighed heavily. 6 months, not what we hoped for, but better than immediate seizure. It gives us time to complete the equipment sales and secure a new location, Delilah agreed, her practical nature asserting itself despite the setback. We can rebuild downstream as Nathan suggested originally. Nathan admired her resilience, but remained concerned about Morrison's next move. The rancher was not a man to accept even a partial defeat without retaliation. As if summoned by his thoughts, Morrison and Weston emerged from the courthouse, accompanied by several rocking hands. They made a deliberate show of checking their weapons before mounting up, a silent warning that the conflict had merely shifted from legal to potentially violent means. That evening, as Nathan and Delilah settled into the small cabin that would serve as their temporary home while proper living arrangements were prepared, the reality of their hasty marriage finally registered. Despite the genuine feelings that had prompted their vows, circumstance had forced a pace that left little time for the normal courtship rituals. Delilah seemed to sense his thoughts as she arranged her few personal belongings in the cabin's simple furnishings. "It's not the wedding night either of us might have imagined," she said softly, a hint of nervousness beneath her practical tone. Nathan moved to her side, taking her hands gently in his. "We can wait, Delilah. There's no rush now that the legal matters are settled." He wanted her to know that despite the strategic elements of their marriage, he respected her enough to proceed at whatever pace made her comfortable. Her blue eyes studied his face with the directness he'd come to cherish. "I didn't marry you solely for legal protection, Nathan McAllister," she said firmly. "I married you because in the short time I've known you, I've seen a man of honor and courage. A man who looks at me and sees not just someone to protect but someone to stand beside." Her cheeks flushed slightly, but her gaze remained steady. "I want a true marriage in every sense." The simple honesty of her declaration touched Nathan deeply. This remarkable woman had chosen him, not despite his drifter's past, but perhaps because of the man it had shaped him into. As he drew her close, their kiss deepened with a new certainty, a promise of the life they would build together despite the challenges ahead. Later, as moonlight filtered through the cabin's window, Nathan held Delilah against his chest, marveling at the twist of fate that had brought him to Pine Creek. The solitary cowboy who believed detachment only brought pain had found something worth the risk, not just in Delilah's beauty or courage, but in the vision of a future where belonging replaced isolation. "What are you thinking?" she murmured, her voice drowsy with contentment. "That I've spent years running from exactly what I needed," he replied honestly, brushing a strand of honey-blonde hair from her face. "A place to stand. A person to stand with." She smiled, pressing closer. "We'll face Morrison together, whatever comes next." "Together," Nathan agreed, the word feeling like a vow more binding than any spoken in the church. The peace of that moment was shattered shortly after dawn by urgent pounding on their door. Nathan rose quickly, pulling on his trousers and reaching for his gun before opening the door to find one of the mill workers, breathless with exertion. "Fire at the lumber stacks," the man gasped. Morrison's men were seen riding away. The next hours passed in desperate struggle, as the entire mill community fought to contain the blaze that threatened their remaining assets. Unlike the previous fire, this one had been set in multiple locations among the stacked timber that represented the Porters' main inventory. By mid-morning, despite their best efforts, nearly half the lumber was destroyed or damaged beyond salvage. As the last flames were extinguished, leaving smoking ruins where neat stacks had stood, Samuel Porter surveyed the destruction with grim resignation. "He's not going to wait 6 months," he said quietly to Nathan and Delilah. "This is just the beginning." Nathan nodded, his shirt soaked with sweat and soot from the firefighting efforts. "We need to accelerate our plans, complete the equipment sales immediately, and move what lumber can be saved." He glanced at Delilah, whose face was streaked with ash but whose determination remained unbroken. and we need to consider how to protect ourselves in the meantime. The solution came from an unexpected quarter. As they discussed options in Porter's office, Dr. Langley arrived from town with surprising news. Judge Wilson has issued warrants for the arrest of 3 Rockingham hands identified by witnesses near the mill before the fire, Langley announced. And more significantly, he's ordered Morrison to maintain a minimum distance from Porter property pending investigation of arson charges. The development was unexpected, given Wilson's previous alignment with Morrison's interests. Delilah voiced the question they all were thinking: why would Wilson suddenly side against Morrison? Langley smiled thinly. It seems your marriage created more complications than anticipated. This morning's territorial newspaper arrived with an interesting article about judicial corruption in frontier communities, specifically mentioning judges who allow personal relationships to influence legal rulings. He spread the newspaper on Porter's desk, revealing the article in question. The territorial governor has apparently taken an interest in ensuring the appearance of judicial propriety in outlying districts. Nathan scanned the article, noting the specific references to water rights disputes and the manipulation of Spanish land grants. Someone has the governor's ear, he observed, and knows the details of our situation. The article carries a Denver byline, Langley confirmed, but the specifics could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of Pine Creek's affairs. He looked meaningfully at Porter. Someone with Eastern connections and a concern for frontier justice. Understanding dawned in Samuel Porter's eyes. Catherine's brother in Boston, the newspaper publisher. I wrote to him after the first fire but never expected. He shook his head in wonder. Morrison isn't the only one with family connections. The intervention bought them precious time and a measure of protection. With Morrison legally restrained from approaching the mill property and his hands under scrutiny for the arson, the Porters were able to complete their equipment sales and salvage operations without further interference. Within a month, they had secured a new location downstream, where Morrison's water rights claims held no legal weight. The operation would be smaller initially, but the strategic retreat Nathan had originally proposed was proceeding according to plan, albeit under more dramatic circumstances than anticipated. Throughout these frantic weeks, Nathan and Delilah's hasty marriage deepened into a partnership that surprised them both with its natural ease. They worked side by side during the day, planning the new mill's construction and overseeing the movement of salvaged equipment. Their nights were spent in the small cabin that had become a haven of warmth and connection amid the chaos of their circumstances. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the valley in gold and crimson, Delilah rested her head against Nathan's shoulder with a contented sigh. "We'll be operational at the new site within weeks," she observed. "Smaller scale, but free from Morrison's interference." Nathan nodded, his arm drawing her closer. "Your father's Eastern orders are holding steady despite the delays. The business will survive." "Thanks to you," Delilah said, tilting her face to his. "Your strategic retreat saved everything that matters." "Not everything," Nathan corrected gently. "You and your father did the hard work of rebuilding. I just suggested a different battlefield." Delilah's expression grew serious. "You did more than that, Nathan. You stayed when staying meant risk. You committed when commitment meant danger." Her hand found his, fingers intertwining. "You changed your entire life's pattern for us, for me." The simple observation struck Nathan with its truth. The man who had spent years avoiding entanglement had willingly, even eagerly, bound himself to this woman and her family's struggles. Yet rather than feeling trapped by these connections, he felt anchored in a way he hadn't since before the war took his father and brother. "It wasn't as difficult a change as you might think," he admitted. "The drifting, the detachment, it was never what I wanted, just what I thought I needed to survive." He brushed a strand of honey-blonde hair from her face. "You showed me there are things worth the risk of loss." Their moment of intimacy was interrupted by the approach of riders, Samuel Porter accompanied by the town's young sheriff, a man who had maintained cautious neutrality in the valley's disputes. "Nathan, Delilah," Porter called as they dismounted. "Sheriff Taylor brings important news." The sheriff removed his hat, his expression grave. Morrison and Weston were caught attempting to forge documentation at the Territorial Land Office in Helena. "It seems they were trying to backdate water rights claims to strengthen their case against your family." "Forgery is a serious charge," Nathan observed. How was it discovered? An alert clerk recognized discrepancies in the paperwork, Taylor explained. When confronted, Weston attempted to flee and was shot resisting arrest. Morrison is in custody, facing multiple charges including the fraud, conspiracy, and now the arson at your mill. Weston apparently implicated him before he died. The news landed with shocking finality. After months of conflict and fear, Morrison's threat had been neutralized not through violence but through his own increasing desperation and lawlessness. What happens now? Delilah asked, her hand tightening in Nathan's. Morrison will likely face trial in Helena, Taylor replied. Given the evidence and Weston's deathbed statement, he's facing years in territorial prison. He hesitated, then added, "There's something else you should know." While searching Morrison's office, authorities found several items apparently taken from the Rocking M bunkhouse when workers departed, including this. The sheriff withdrew a worn Bible from his saddlebag, extending it to Nathan. The clerk said it had McAllister written inside the cover. Thought it might be yours. Nathan accepted the Bible with stunned gratitude, opening the cover to confirm the familiar handwriting, his father's careful script recording family births, marriages, and deaths. The tintype was still there, tucked between the pages, his parents' solemn faces looking out from another time. "Thank you," he said simply, unable to adequately express what the recovery meant to him. As Taylor departed, Delilah gently touched the Bible in Nathan's hands. "Your family," she said softly, "the memories you thought lost." "Not lost," Nathan corrected, looking from the tintype to her face. "Just waiting to be joined by new memories." He carefully opened the Bible to the family record page, where generations of McAllisters had recorded their histories. "There's space here for our story now. For whatever future we build." Samuel Porter cleared his throat, reminding them of his presence. "Speaking of futures," he said, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile, "with Morrison's legal claims invalidated, Judge Wilson has reversed his ruling on our original mill site. We can maintain operations there if we choose, with our water rights fully restored." The news represented a complete reversal of their fortunes, not just survival through strategic retreat, but full vindication and restoration. Yet as Nathan looked at Delilah, he saw in her eyes the same thought that had occurred to him. "The new site is still worth developing," she said, confirming his instinct. "Smaller initially, but with room to grow. We could operate both eventually, with the right management." Her father nodded approvingly. "My thoughts exactly. The valley's growing. There's demand enough for both operations with the railroad spur coming through next year." He glanced between them with shrewd assessment. The new mill would need someone to oversee it, someone with strategic thinking and the courage to build something from the ground up. The offer was clear, a future not just as a hired hand, but as a partner in the Porter family business. Nathan felt Delilah's questioning gaze, waiting for his response. A year ago, such permanence would have triggered his instinct to move on. Now, it felt like the natural next step in a journey that had begun the moment he stepped between Delilah and Morrison in town. "I'd be honored," Nathan replied, his arm tightening around Delilah's waist, "though I suspect my wife will have plenty of ideas about how the operation should be run." Delilah's laugh was bright in the evening air. "You suspect correctly, Mr. McAllister. I didn't spend years learning the business to be merely decorative." As Porter departed for his own home, leaving them to their evening, Nathan and Delilah remained on the porch, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the sky. The Bible lay open on Nathan's lap, the family record page waiting for new entries. "What shall we write first?" Delilah asked, tracing the blank space below his parents' marriage date. Nathan considered the question, thinking of all that had transpired since he rode into Pine Creek. The solitary drifter who believed detachment only brought pain had found a home, a purpose, and a love worth any risk. The woman beside him had transformed his understanding of strength, showing him that the courage to connect was greater than the caution of isolation. "Our beginning," he said simply, drawing her closer as the night settled gently around them. "The rest we'll write together." In the years that followed, the pages of the McAllister family Bible filled with new entries: their marriage, the birth of their children, the expansion of the mill operations into one of the territory's most successful lumber businesses. Each milestone marked not just their growing prosperity, but the deepening of a partnership forged in crisis and strengthened through shared purpose. And if anyone in Pine Creek noticed that the once solitary cowboy who had drifted into their valley had become one of its most respected businessmen and devoted family men, they attributed it to the transformative power of finding the right place and the right person to call home.